This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a British medical journal analysis authored by two of the most respected health economists in the world. It projects that a trade deal between the United Kingdom and the first Trump administration will produce roughly 229,000 excess deaths in England by 2036, add Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, and that figure approaches 300,000. That is nearly twice the confirmed COVID death toll in the United Kingdom. And unlike a pandemic, this outcome is not caused by a virus. It is the deliberate product of a single policy choice, diverting £44.7 billion from the National Health Service into the patent-protected profit margins of American pharmaceutical companies. From a class analysis standpoint, these numbers are not an exaggeration. They are actuarial description wrapped in epidemiology, derived from government data, treasury projections, and the NHS's own cost-effectiveness frameworks. Introduction. Why you probably never heard this. Why have you probably never heard of this deal? The answer is structural, not accidental. The government never explained it to the public in clear terms. Parliament never debated it in any meaningful way. The Health Select Committee did not open an inquiry. The Business and Trade Committee stayed silent. The impact assessment was conducted internally and immediately classified. The statutory instrument used to change the legal framework was released at 7 p.m. on a Friday evening before an Easter holiday weekend. Mainstream media, already commercially weakened and oriented toward Westminster process, ignored the story for months. It required the British Medical Journal to publish detailed modeling on the front page of a national newspaper before the BBC and Sky News began to treat it as news. By then, many of the deal's requirements had already been enacted. NICE, the independent body that appraises whether medicines should be funded by the NHS, had already amended its cost-effectiveness guidelines. The horse was not merely out of the stable. It was halfway down the motorway. This story matters not only because of the human magnitude. It matters because of the method. The government treated one of the most significant public health decisions in living memory as a routine commercial negotiation and deliberately insulated it from democratic scrutiny. From a class analysis perspective, that insulation was the entire point. When a policy transfers wealth from hundreds of thousands of patients to multinational shareholders while producing catastrophic health outcomes, public debate becomes an obstacle to profit. So the government removed the obstacle. This is therefore not a failure of transparency. It is an operational feature of a system that treats public goods as private revenue streams and citizen health as an externality to be negotiated away in closed rooms. The people who will die under this policy had no representative in the room. The negotiators were trade officials, pharmaceutical lobbyists, and ministerial advisors whose career paths often loop between government and industry. That absence of democratic representation is not an unfortunate side effect of complex tradecraft. It is the operational logic of a system in which profit interests are embedded in the state and popular needs are treated as line items to be minimized. Mechanics of the capitulation. The statutory instrument was released at 7 p.m. on a Friday before an Easter holiday weekend. Not an oversight, but a calculated decision to reduce parliamentary scrutiny and media attention. The Business and Trade Committee stayed silent. The Health Select Committee opened no inquiry. The impact assessment was classified. MPs were not allowed to see the figures or assumptions before the provisions took effect. This is how a policy projected to cause close to 300,000 excess deaths is enacted in a system that still calls itself democratic. The mechanism exploits the asymmetry between concentrated corporate interests and dispersed public costs. Pharmaceutical companies deployed lobbyists, former ministers, and legal specialists whose full-time job was to shape the deal's language. Patients were represented only by abstract treasury models, and the occasional parliamentary question answered weeks after the provisions were already law. The result is a legally binding transfer of life years from working-class patients to pharmaceutical shareholders, already in motion. It will unfold quietly, buried in waiting list statistics, without the dramatic hospital footage that mobilizes empathy during a viral outbreak. That quietness is intentional. Chapter 1. The structural edge the NHS forfeited. To understand the scale of this capitulation, you have to understand what the United Kingdom lost. The National Health Service was built on a structural principle that modern neoliberalism has spent decades attacking. The British state is the near monopsonate buyer of prescription medicines for a captured population. Because almost every GP prescription, every hospital-administered drug, and every community health intervention flows through NHS contracts, the service possesses extraordinary pricing leverage. Economists describe this as monopsonate power, the ability of a single large buyer to set terms rather than accept them. When every pharmaceutical company wants access to the entire UK population, and the only legal route to those patients is through NHS procurement, the state can demand evidence of effectiveness, compare value across competing products, and refuse to pay prices that exceed health benefit. For decades, this kept British drug spending far below American levels while maintaining universal access. NICE became a global reference for fair, evidence-based medicine appraisal. It approved the vast majority of medicines it reviewed, but it also rejected expensive compounds that offered marginal benefit at astronomical cost. Those rejections kept prices in check and protected the overall NHS budget. The industry hated it with a burning intensity that would later prove decisive. The NHS model threatened the global pricing architecture that allows companies to charge Americans 5, 10, 15 times as much as Europeans for the identical compound. If Britain could prove that innovative medicines did not require monopoly prices, that logic would spread. If NHS pricing became the norm, the global profit margins underpinning the entire pharmaceutical sector would collapse. The industry therefore made the destruction of that pricing architecture a strategic priority. The mechanism by which NICE controlled prices was elegant in its simplicity. A new drug would be evaluated against existing alternatives for a specific condition. If the drug offered an additional quality-adjusted life year at a cost below a threshold calibrated to the NHS's opportunity cost, it was approved. If it exceeded that threshold, it was rejected or negotiated down. This protected the NHS from being used as a dumping ground for marginally improved compounds sold at stratospheric markups. It also created a global evidentiary standard that other health systems could emulate. That standard, multiplied across dozens of countries, represented an existential threat to the business model of patent-based pharmaceutical profits. The industry therefore poured resources into lobbying against NICE-style mechanisms wherever they appeared, funding think tanks, commissioning favorable research, and cultivating political relationships designed to weaken price controls. Chapter 2. The campaign of coordinated threats. The pressure campaign was coordinated corporate extortion. During the year preceding the trade talks, pharmaceutical companies threatened to pull investments, stop launching new medicines, relocate manufacturing abroad, and abandon the British market. The message was unambiguous: raise our prices or lose access to medicine. Donald Trump amplified this with bombast about Britain freeloading on American healthcare spending, providing political cover for what was fundamentally ransom note diplomacy. The industry's complaint that UK prices did not cover development costs was self-serving on a scale that was rarely examined. Development costs are already supported by taxpayer-funded research, tax incentives, and 20-year patent monopolies. The actual manufacturing cost is a tiny fraction of the retail price. High prices are therefore not a functional requirement for innovation. They are rent extraction. The government knew this. It chose to treat shareholder demands as legitimate constraints on public policy rather than lobbying pressure to be resisted on behalf of citizens. Chapter 3. The numbers that refuse to disappear. The deal commits the UK to substantially increase pharmaceutical expenditure inside the NHS. But here's the critical arithmetic. There was no accompanying increase in the overall NHS budget. No treasury top-up. No ring-fence funding. The extra billions therefore had to be found by robbing other parts of an already stretched health budget. Hospital maintenance, bed capacity, social care for the elderly, nurse staffing, cancer screening, A&E waiting times, preventive medicine for heart disease and stroke, mental health services, all had to shrink so that pharmaceuticals could grow. The deal did not add health resources to the system. It reshuffled them from general medical care into corporate pharmaceutical profit. The BMJ modeling that measures the human cost of this reshuffling was conducted by Karl Clax Claxton and Andrew Hill. Claxton is a health economist who was instrumental in creating NICE and has spent decades working on the economics of healthcare resource allocation. Hill is a globally recognized authority on drug pricing at the University of Liverpool. They are not activists on the fringes of public debate. They are the exact professionals whose methodologies the government itself relies upon when deciding which medicines to fund and how to allocate scarce resources. They took official treasury projections, official growth assumptions, and NICE cost-effectiveness frameworks, and they asked a simple question. If £44.7 billion is redirected from general NHS spending into pharmaceuticals over 10 years, how many avoidable deaths will result? They used quality-adjusted life years to measure the health lost when resources are diverted from cost-effective general care into overpriced medicines. The answer is 229,000 excess deaths in England and close to 300,000 across the whole United Kingdom. This is not a worst-case scenario. It is not fringe scholarship relying on controversial assumptions. It is the government's own mathematics applied to the government's own deal. When Carl Claxton talks about 229,000 deaths, he is not engaging in metaphor or political rhetoric. He is performing actuarial description with the full methodological authority of the system he helped build. The reaction from government ministers was not engagement with the methodology. It was dismissal without argument. Wes Streeting, then the health secretary, claimed that NHS services would not be cut and that the deal would not cost patients anything. Those claims are arithmetically impossible. Anyone who has studied basic budget mathematics understands that allocating more to one category while holding total spending flat requires cutting other categories. The health secretary either did not understand the deal he was signing, which would be grossly negligent at a moment of national health crisis, or he was deliberately misleading the public, which is ethically worse. Neither possibility is acceptable for the person responsible for the NHS. Chapter 4. The class analysis of who wins and who pays. From a class analysis standpoint, the mechanism is brutally straightforward. Wealth is being transferred from working class patients and frontline NHS staff to multinational pharmaceutical shareholders and senior executives whose compensation is tied to stock performance. The beneficiaries also include lobbying firms, public relations consultancies, and think tanks that defended the deal in private while reassuring the public that nothing important was changing. The losers are the patients who will face longer waiting lists for MRI scanning, delayed cancer diagnoses, the closure of local services, reduced social care, and fewer nurses and doctors per hospital bed. They are the majority of the country who depend on the NHS for survival and who have no private insurance fallback. They are also the academic critics whose research is now being overridden, the public health officials whose advice has been sidelined, and the parliamentary democracy whose scrutiny has been bypassed. The government's argument that the UK had no choice but to accept the deal rests on the claim that the first Trump administration would have imposed tariffs of up to 100% on UK pharmaceuticals exported to the United States. That threat sounded terrifying until you examine the evidence. The United States Supreme Court had already limited the president's authority to impose tariffs of that scale without congressional approval. Major pharmaceutical companies, including UK-based GSK and AstraZeneca, had already secured their own tariff-free access to the American market through direct negotiations with the White House. They did not need this deal to protect their exports. Germany, France, Spain, and the Netherlands faced identical tariff exposure and identical corporate threats. None of them surrendered their price controls. Germany and France in particular faced an intense lobbying campaign, yet both held the line. Australia rejected similar pressure entirely. The United Kingdom is therefore not a victim of irresistible external force. It is the outlier that shows submission because its political class is structurally sympathetic to the interests those companies represent. Shareholder capitalism, deregulation, and the belief that public goods should be captured by private rentiers whenever possible were not accidental adjuncts to this deal. They were the design parameters from the beginning. The government wanted to please Donald Trump, get the drug industry off its back, and believe, probably correctly, that secrecy and parliamentary obstruction would allow it to sneak a deal of this magnitude through before the public understood what was happening. Chapter 5. The pharmaceutical innovation myth. The most persistent defense of high drug prices is the claim that they finance research and development. The data tells a different story. Large pharmaceutical companies consistently spend more on stock buybacks, executive compensation, and marketing than they spend on genuine research and development. Many breakthrough medicines emerge from publicly funded basic science, national institutes of health-style investment, university laboratories, and publicly owned intellectual property. The pharmaceutical industry's downstream function is to patent those publicly funded discoveries, suppress generic competition through patent evergreening, and sell them back to publicly funded health systems at monopoly markups. That is not innovation. That is rent extraction. A genuinely public pharmaceutical sector would develop medicines with health outcomes as the primary objective and stock price as a secondary concern. It would set prices based on production cost and public return, not based on the maximum the market will bear. It would reinvest research returns into further science rather than shareholder dividends. That model threatens pharmaceutical profit, which is precisely why the industry defends the current system with everything it has: lobbying expenditures, campaign finance, think tank front groups, and, when necessary, direct threats to national health systems. NICE already approves over 90% of the drugs it reviews. Under the terms of this deal, NICE estimates that it will approve only 1 to 5 additional medicines per year than would otherwise be the case. 229,000 deaths for a handful of marginally incremental approvals is not a rational trade-off. It is extortion dressed as modernization. The patient who dies because her cancer drug was deprioritized to free up budget for a marginally better cholesterol medicine is not a statistic. She is the human cost of a pricing system that cannot distinguish between genuine innovation and corporate rent-seeking. Chapter 6. Democratic failure as operational method. The process violations were extraordinary by any standard of democratic governance. The government conducted an impact assessment but refused to publish it. Members of parliament were not allowed to see the figures or the detailed assumptions. When snippets emerged, ministers claimed that NHS services would not be cut and that there would be no impact on patient care. Those claims were either dishonest or indicative of incompetence so profound as to constitute gross negligence. Statutory instruments were used to change primary health legislation. Statutory instruments are designed for minor technical adjustments. Using them to rewrite the framework governing NICE, the body that decides which medicines the NHS will fund, is a constitutional abuse. The government timed its release for 7 p.m. on a Friday before a long holiday weekend, an explicit calculation that the press would be slow to respond and parliament would be in recess. The Health Select Committee did not open an inquiry. The Business and Trade Committee stayed silent. For months, mainstream political journalism, obsessed with leadership stats and polling trivia, treated the story as either too complicated or too peripheral. British media, already weakened by commercial pressure and the decline of public service broadcasting, failed in its primary duty to hold power to account. Meanwhile, Just Treatment and Global Justice now launched a judicial review challenging the lawfulness of using secondary legislation to alter primary health frameworks without proper parliamentary procedure. If the courts agree that the process was unlawful, the NICE guideline changes could be overturned, allowing Parliament to reconsider the deal on proper terms. 30 members of Parliament signed a prayer motion objecting to the statutory instrument, and backbench pressure is growing as the BMJ figures circulate. That opposition is still small relative to the scale of the harm, but it demonstrates that the parliamentary consensus for secrecy is beginning to crack under the weight of public evidence. Chapter 7. The international context and class isolation. The United Kingdom has not only harmed itself, By surrendering, it has handed the pharmaceutical lobby a template for future extortion across Europe. Every government now facing similar pressure can point to Britain and ask why they should resist when the UK did not. Germany, France, Spain, and the Netherlands held the line. Australia refused to accept that high domestic drug prices were the price of trade access. The UK has now weakened the continent's collective negotiating position, giving the industry a propaganda victory that will be deployed against every public health system in the developed world. This is what class power looks like when it does not need guns. It operates by controlling information, timing, and process. It relies on the assumption that working class patients are too busy surviving to parse statutory instruments published at 7 p.m. on holiday weekends. It relies on the belief that parliamentary backbenchers are easier to outmaneuver than corporate lobbyists. And it produces outcomes measured in preventable death. A society that allows 229,000 excess deaths to be modeled in secret, negotiated in private, and approved without debate is not a democracy in any meaningful sense. It is a managed polity in which executive authority and corporate power operate in close coordination, with public consent manufactured through media neglect and political distraction. The NHS was supposed to be the institutional expression of a different social contract, one in which health is a universal right rather than a market commodity. This deal represents the latest and deadliest attempt to replace that contract with the logic of shareholder value. Mechanics of capitulation, financial architecture. £44.7 billion redirected over 10 years. Per year, that is an average of £4,470 million taken from general NHS services and transferred to patented drug budgets. At NICE's own cost-effectiveness threshold, a single quality-adjusted life year is worth roughly £20,000 to £30,000. Redirecting £44.7 billion away from care that preserves those life years toward expensive drugs with marginal benefit is therefore an arithmetic certainty of mass mortality. The BMJ authors did not need to imagine worst-case scenarios. They applied the government's own pricing framework to the government's own spending decision and read off the consequences. The government's response was not to engage with the arithmetic, but to dismiss the authors as politically motivated. Beyond mortality, there is morbidity. Patients living with controlled conditions whose drugs become unaffordable, whose monitoring is deferred, whose quality of life deteriorates quietly. There is system stress. Hospitals absorbing the failure of preventive pharmacology through emergency admissions. There is staff morale. Nurses and doctors watching treatments they recommend become unavailable because budget has been pre-committed to more expensive alternatives. There is international reputation. UK medical research loses the pricing diversity that made its trials attractive to global partners. Each of these dimensions compounds the core mortality figure, making the real toll larger than the BMJ's already staggering projection. Chapter 8. The future of the NHS as a public project. This is not simply a story about one bad negotiation. It is about the long-term trajectory of whether the NHS remains a public service or becomes a revenue stream for multinational capital. The deal locks the system into higher drug spending without additional funding, creating a structural deficit that will be cited for years to justify further cuts to hospitals, staff, and social care. Every future chancellor who wants to reduce the apparent NHS budget will look at £44.7 billion locked into pharmaceuticals and say there is no alternative. That is how policy momentum becomes political inevitability. Breaking that momentum requires not just reversing this deal, but rebuilding the political argument that health is a right and pharmaceutical research is a public good, not a private cash cow. An expanded public pharmaceutical sector could manufacture and develop medicines directly, keeping returns inside the NHS rather than shipping them offshore. It could set prices based on production cost and public health value rather than monopoly markup. It could reinvest research returns into further science rather than shareholder dividends. Many developed nations already operate public pharmaceutical capacity with better outcomes and lower prices than the UK. Expanding that capacity would not destroy innovation. It would redirect innovation toward health outcomes rather than stock market performance. That model threatens pharmaceutical profit, which is precisely why the industry defends the current system with lobbying, campaign finance, and direct threats to national health services. Organizing implications. Effective opposition to this deal requires 3 concrete steps. First, Andy Burnham must publish the secret impact assessment in full. Redacting commercial sensitivities is acceptable. Hiding mortality projections behind commercial confidentiality is not. Second, Parliament must restore NICE's statutory independence and require primary legislation for any future change to medicine appraisal frameworks. Third, the UK should pursue a public pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity that allows the NHS to develop or produce essential medicines directly, breaking the monopoly leverage that made this capitulation possible. None of these steps require new technology or unprecedented resources. They require political courage that has so far been absent. The NHS was created because working class pressure made the cost of inaction higher than the cost of reform. It survived decades of privatization by stealth because the people who use it vote, protest, and remember election promises. This deal represents a different threat because it operates through trade law, secondary legislation, and fiscal constraint rather than outright ownership transfer. That makes it harder to campaign against using the traditional language of saving the NHS. The language that fits is class justice. A government has chosen to let hundreds of thousands of working class patients die so that American shareholders do not experience a reduction in portfolio returns. That choice should be the defining issue of the next election. Conclusion. 229,000 excess deaths in England. Close to 300,000 across the UK. Social care slashed. Cancer waits longer. Hospital beds fewer. Nurses and doctors understaffed. Hospital infrastructure decaying. Also that American pharmaceutical shareholders can maintain profit margins that already exceed research spending by multiples. This is not unfortunate policy. This is not the price of globalization. This is a class policy enacted in secrecy, defended by lies, and ratified by parliamentary neglect. The argument that the UK was powerless is false. The country has world-leading medical research, diplomatic weight, European allies who wanted collective resistance, and a domestic pharmaceutical industry employing tens of thousands of scientists. The companies needed this deal far more than Britain did. Britain chose submission because its political class was already aligned with those companies' interests. The NHS has survived its creation against the opposition of the medical establishment, the Conservative Party, and the pharmaceutical industry. It survived decades of privatization by stealth. But this is different. This is a permanent legal commitment to redirect the drug budget toward higher prices while keeping total spending flat. Once locked in, reversing it will require legislative majorities, international negotiations, and political courage that the current generation of leaders has not yet demonstrated. The only institutions that have ever saved the NHS are the people who use it and the people who care for it. They are the ones who must make this issue too expensive and too politically dangerous for any member of parliament to ignore. CTA, share this video, like it, subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, write to your parliamentary representative. Showing just treatment and global justice now. Demand that Andy Burnham publish the secret impact assessment and reopen this deal. The lives of your parents, your grandparents, your children, and your neighbors depend on it. Do not look away. Do not scroll past. This is real. This is now. And this is an emergency that requires drastic action now. Please like, comment, follow, and share. It really helps out. Until next time, comrades.